Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Izzy Fuqua. I'm the Adult Programs Coordinator for the VMFA, and I have had the delight of working with Dr. Christopher Oliver, Dr. Johanna Minich, and Victoria and Dean Ferguson on today's event, Community Conversation, the Natural Bridge and the Monacan Indian Nation. So today you will be hearing from 4 speakers. Like I said, the exhibition curator, Dr. Christopher Oliver, who is also the VMFA Assistant Curator of American Art. We'll be joined by Dr. Johanna Minich, the Assistant Curator for the Native American Art at VMFA, and then Victoria and Dean Ferguson, who have also contributed to the exhibition and an educational blog post on the topic.
All right, well, thank you, Izzy. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. As Izzy mentioned, my name is Chris Oliver, and I had the pleasure of working with a great team to assemble the Natural Bridge exhibition, Virginia, Arcadia, the Natural Bridge in American Art. And today, the 4 of us will talk about the exhibition, but larger histories surrounding the site as well, specifically those concerning Virginia Indians and the Monacan Indian Nation. This is in relationship, of course, to the Natural Bridge exhibition that is on view until August 1st. I do hope that if you haven't visited the show, you will take advantage of the last couple of weeks and come to Richmond and see this great show. Well, before we get to Victoria and Dean, I want to put their knowledge base in the context of the exhibition itself and how this came to be and what work and thoughts they've contributed to the show. So it was, the show has been several years in the making. As I was assembling the checklist, it was very obvious to me about who these landscapes were created for and who was to be enjoying them. And that largely excluded a large portion of Virginia's inhabitants, its indigenous populations. So while the exhibition really is chronologically only about 120 years, that is about 1780s to 1900, there's a much longer, centuries and centuries long history of people interacting with and living near the Natural Bridge. And so hopefully today's conversation will expand upon what is presented in the exhibition and talk more about that, as well as responding to the art itself. So the Natural Bridge of Virginia, just to make sure we're all on the same page, is this 215-foot tall geological formation in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. And here it is roughly indicated on this map at right. And this is how we're used to, of course, seeing maps showing where this site is. But it's important to think about the Commonwealth of Virginia or the colony and then Commonwealth as a home for hundreds of thousands of native Virginians. Here is a map roughly showing some of the inhabited areas and which corresponding languages were spoken in these areas. So one of the things we thought to do about 1.5 years ago was engage with some members of our community outside of VMFA, including Dean and Vicky, to think about how we can represent this history outside of physical objects we can show in the exhibition. And the result of that was some sections of the galleries where we have language and maps, very similar to the map we just showed, that talk about the Native American presence at Natural Bridge, alongside, as you see in the image at left, the works of art themselves. And so it's with that contribution to the show that Victoria and Dean added, again, about 1.5 years ago, and it's been wonderful to work with them. I know we've had a great time chatting, including earlier today, just as we were waiting for everyone to get on this call. And so with that, I'm going to excuse myself and let Dean and Vicky introduce themselves and talk about their knowledge and history at the Natural Bridge. So Dean and Vicky, please join us.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, and thank you to the staff of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts for inviting us to speak today and letting us be a part of what's going on there. My name is Victoria Ferguson. I am an enrolled member of the Monacan Indian Nation of Virginia, and this is my husband, Dean Ferguson. And we have been involved with Natural Bridge since 1999. It's over 20 years. But the Native American relationship with the land goes back thousands of years. Native American occupation at the bridge was really a long time ago, started a long time ago, long before the arrival of the Europeans and before colonization. Now, in the early 50s, and that's 1950s, a makeshift dig was done mainly by workmen who were building on the property. By today's standards, we certainly would not call what they did archaeology. They did find human remains. And without carbon dating, we have no idea of the date of what they found. There were notes taken and the documentation just stated that there were 12 remains. In one row, there was 5 bodies, and in the next row, it was 7. They were buried in flex position facing the west. There was also a projectile point as a grave goods that was buried along with them, also facing toward the west. Now, of course, most of the time you'd go, well, what happened to them? You know, where are they? Especially today with NACRA, that's a question that we have. The documentation went on to say that the bones were very brittle and more than likely have become part of the foundation of the building. We have no knowledge of what happened to the projectile point as the site wasn't secured. This discovery has served to fuel the legend, the Monacan legend of Natural Bridge. Now, Natural Bridge is seen as a spiritual place to Native Americans in general and Monacans in particular. Having a known burial area adds to the importance of the sacredness of the site. The bridge almost sits in the center of the land inhabited by the towns that was once part of the powerful Monacan Confederacy. So as tribal members, we see the importance of us, the original caretakers, having our story told and controlling the narrative of how the knowledge should be shared with the public. We also understand the importance of having access to the bridge for ceremonies and prayers. And that's something we did often when we operated the Monacan exhibit, but we did not do that for the general public. Natural Bridge received the National Historic Landmark designation in 1998. The Natural Bridge Hotel then understood the importance of bridging the relationship with the tribe when they contacted us in 1999. They approached the Monacan Indian Nation and suggested a joint project to do just that, to bridge these two things together. The tribe contacted my husband and I. He had construction and he had experience with the late woodland construction and historical interpretation from his work at Virginia's Explore Park here in Roanoke, Virginia. I had been there for a number of years as a Native representative and a volunteer. So when the call came into us, we decided to write a proposal for the project. The exhibit would sit on Natural Bridge land and we would have access to almost 1,600 acres for the acquisition of natural resources needed to do this project. The Natural Bridge itself would sell the tickets, they would schedule the programs, and they would pay the staff. And the tribe would provide the volunteer and have ownership of the tribal history and the narrative. The documentation would come from many hours of work that Dean and I had already put in and we had already compiled. So Dean was then hired as the project coordinator and the first director of interpretive programs at Natural Bridge. So I'm gonna let Dean tell you what he had in mind when he started this program and what were some of the main components that he used to do that.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate you guys having us today. It's a pleasure. Thank you. Having come from a world of reconstructive archaeology, the whole idea that I really wanted to push was to take the opportunity on my own, based upon the local archaeology, to first and foremost construct the most accurate representation of a Monacan house, Ati, using post-mold patterns from pre-existing sites, primarily located here in the Roanoke Valley. the Buzzard Rock site, where post-mold patterns for that original structure that once stood there 800 to 1,000 years ago. It had all of the late woodland components that were specific to what we were hoping to address. One of the things that, among other things that I really wanted to do with this was to take this program based upon archaeology and then tweak it to where we could, programming wise, we had tool making, which, or what most folks would call flint knapping, making projectile points, the Aboriginal construction techniques, the use of natural resources, rope making, just an attempt to lay out in a very orderly, concise fashion what we believe the daily routine in life would have been for Native people in the region. It was very important to me, having visited a number of sites, Indian sites throughout the Southeast and Virginia, and most of them, you know, they really left much to be desired. There was very little thought and effort placed into them. Materials that were used was everything from twine to PCP pipe and roofing shingles and things such as that, which of course Monacan people would have never have used. So the ability to go out here and on that 1,600 acre facility, campus, we were effectively able to harvest bark, saplings, cattails, a fair amount of resources for natural rope making and things such as that. We then put that into our daily presentations. It was based upon how we see in the archaeology of the region and the dispensation of artifacts associated to these primary sites. And to the idea was to introduce folks to the most accurate and I would even say heartfelt attempt at giving American Indian people, and in this specific Monacan people, an accurate and fair shake. Primary source documentation was imperative. The whole idea of bringing somebody in who would say, well, you know, this was that and this was that, and with very little academic background to support these things. And it comes down once again to reaching out to a number of individuals, particularly Dr. Michael B. Barber, who became a very close friend of mine. Whenever I was in a position where I needed to know something, all I had to do was pick up the phone and call Dr. Barber. There were other archaeologists in the that would pass through in Carol Nash, absolutely. Tom Klatka, so many, yes. I mean, there was so many people because my background only went so far, and understanding my limitations, I definitely wanted to move beyond my limitations, and in the spirit of trying to create an accurate representation, these are the folks that really helped us kick it up to a very high standard. We relied upon the history of what was available. And you go back 20, 25 years ago, there was, most of the history is contained within the archaeological record. It's not until we get into the 21st century, really, where you start to get some more definitive works, some more clarifications on this, clarifications on that, etc. And then something else that was very important was the necessity to have the Monacan people themselves involved and the utilization of their oral traditions. Such as it was, due to the destruction of the culture, there were a lot of gaps. And so what I did was, as we run this thing around, we decided that what we would do is I would get with Chief Branham, who was Kenny Branham, Chief of the Monacan Nation. And I said, Kenny, do you want to come on board with me and do this? And of course, Kenny jumped right in. And that's when we were able to then bring the Monacan people personally into this project, and have a thing to where the Monacan people, per the chief, actually was having to say about things. And that became one of the things that really struck with me. And then one of my favorite movies is an old Kevin Costner movie called Field of Dreams. I love that. I'm a baseball nut. But in that, build it and they will come. And that's what we did. And through that first year, we started in November of '99, I believe, and then we opened the site to the public on April 1 in the year 2000. We weren't finished by any means, and it took us another 2 years to get that first phase of palisade, work shelters, fire pits, cooking areas, and that #1 wigwam constructed. And with that, we were then able to turn our direction into a part that I was very unfamiliar with, and I had no interest in, but that was the marketing, you know, and there's where it got weird, because that's when we became an attraction, which I was never comfortable with that at all. However, be it as it may, we took this from what we had to work with, and I think that in the course from about 2000 to around 2005, we created an excellent interpretive program. And I say we because no one person could have done this. There was no way I could do this by myself without Victoria, without Chief Branham. My teaching abilities could only go so far in sharing my knowledge, and then the attempt to insert this into the Monacan people. No, you weren't buffalo hunters. No, you didn't live in teepees. And no, you didn't wear these Sioux war bonnets. All of this came as part of that learning curve that Chief Branham embraced. It helped us all. And once we were able to get this and increase the visitation at Natural Bridge, I told him we'll get 100,000 people. And we did. Much to my chagrin at times. There was a lot of people.
You know, I'm going to add to that because, you know, one of the things he mentioned earlier was oral traditions and working within the tribe. We hired one of the tribal elders, Miss Birdie, to work down there with us. And once we were able to start to bring in that type of knowledge, we saw how important it was that we were protecting and preserving culture, history, and Monacan lifeways, because we were able to bring the things that we had done growing up in our families down to the exhibit and let them become a part of the lessons or the stories that we were telling people. And hiring people like Miss Birdie, who was a tribal elder, allowed us the opportunity to really help get that story out and help people to see the importance of protecting and preserving our history and culture. And that's what we've been doing all that time is getting that program going, protecting our history and culture, and sharing the knowledge that we had with the people who would visit. I think one year we did maybe 15,000 school kids came down through there for SOL-based presentations, which we tie those into what we're already doing down there. So it makes a meaningful visit to the schools. A visitation did drop off when the gas prices went really high in the early 2000s because school systems just couldn't afford to do that. But we did something else, and that was called outreach.
Yeah, we were going to schools. Chief Branham, I don't know how many schools he alone visited, bringing our program throughout the Piedmont and Blue Ridge regions of the Commonwealth. But you know, one of the things that I found that needed to be done was a brand new approach to interpretation of the natural bridge, specific to the natural bridge. I found out that in the past there had been some attempts, but they were poor. The science, the academics behind it were very poor, and it just wasn't what it was supposed to be. So once we got this village up and rolling, and Chief and Vicky and everybody, Miss Birdie Branham and all the others wonderful people who were involved with it, I kind of stepped back away from it and began to work on the natural bridge story in itself. And it became a really important part of the natural bridge experience. The whole idea, once again, was to look at the cultural, historical, and biodiversity of the natural bridge, which is amazing. And if for anyone who has never visited Natural Bridge, you really should take a little trip to Natural Bridge, Virginia. And I think you might see what I'm talking about. It was something genuine, and you really had not to simply see it, but experience it. And then to enhance that, I began to develop an interpretive program that, as I say, the cultural, historical, biodiversity of the park into 15 and 30 and 1 hour segments in order to address whatever interpretive challenge I was presented with. Much of it was first person, but a lot of it was simply with groups of people who wanted to know, how was the bridge built? How did this happen? You know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that was amazing to talk about the age of the natural bridge, the creation of the continents, and all of that falls right into the story of the natural bridge. But something else that really attracted me to developing these programs, of course, was the historical aspects of it. There was so much history around it, it's kind of hard to put it all into focus, so scaled it down. One of the things that Natural Bridge has always been known for, and one of the earliest marketing tools, I don't know if you can see this very well. This is a cast made by a friend of mine, Mark Klein, who lives in the Valley, and folks in the Shenandoah Valley and Lexington area, they know Mark Klein quite well. Mark did this, probably 15, 16, 17 years ago, scaling up to the 18.5-foot distance from the ground to the top and making these casts of George Washington's initials. And that's actually now a cast of those initials. The thing about this here is that I have never been able to find one single solitary written document that George Washington ever visited Natural Bridge. There is no account in his day book. There was no survey, which is what he supposedly was there for. It just didn't exist. So what I basically did was just come to the point of simply saying that these initials are apocryphal at the best. I always back that up with this, though. In 1756, George Washington was dispatched by Assistant Governor of the Colony of Virginia, Lord Dinwiddie, to see that a series of frontier forts were constructed up from the upper Shenandoah, actually Fort Pitt, all the way down to the regions in Tennessee. So what we know is right 2 miles from the Natural Bridge itself was Fort Audley Paul, which was one of those frontier ports, constructed specifically as a way station for these migrating Scots, Irish, and Germans out of the north, heading south down the Great Road into the interior of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, and establishing these early settlements. Through the attempt to research out the George Washington connection, always ran into a wall. Now, he could have been there, most certainly. Simply, I could never find any evidence he was there as a surveyor. Could George Washington have scaled up there and put his initials on the wall? I can certainly see an 18-year-old young man, or maybe 21, whatever he was, as a young militia lieutenant, scaling that and putting his initials on the wall, most certainly. But as a surveyor, I don't think so. What was factual was that in 1767, a young Thomas Jefferson began his law career at Augusta Courthouse. And with Dabney Carr, close friend, they made a trip to the Natural Bridge. He was aware of the Natural Bridge through his father, Peter Jefferson, who had actually worked on one of the first actual functional maps of the region. So Peter Jefferson was quite aware of the property. Of course, this was Crown property at the time. Thomas Jefferson visited and was just, he was astonished. The words he basically said, I can't, it's indescribable. So he returned back in 1772 with an inquiry as to the purchase of the property. Here's another very telling thing. There is no patent. There is no survey. So Thomas Jefferson had the property surveyed himself. And it was surveyed out a plat of 157 acres, including the Natural Bridge. And upon this, on the 5th of July in the year 1774, Thomas Jefferson paid this very, very minimal amount, as would appear today, for the purchase of the property. And then Mr. Jefferson would own and maintain the property from July 1774 until his death on the 4th of July in 1826. Jefferson, we know he visited the Natural Bridge, documented about 4 times. It may have been more times after, but that's what we have documented. He was a very busy fellow. Most of those trips occurred after he was president. And even in one time, in, I believe it was in 1817 or 1818, he was trying to sell the property. Mr. Jefferson, as you probably very well know, always maintained a substantial debt. The taxes on the property were well overdue, and he thought that maybe he could sell the property. But this is what I learned about Thomas Jefferson. Loved the Natural Bridge. He was deeply connected to the Natural Bridge. He didn't trust the people he was talking to. Therefore, he refused to sell it. And so he would be maintained. There's something else that's fascinating about Jefferson's time there was Mr. Jefferson hired a free man, an African-American from the state of North Carolina in 1805. The gentleman's name was Patrick Henry. Don't confuse him with the fiery little orator with the Give Me Death speech.
Liberty or death.
Yeah, this fella took over the management of Mr. Jefferson's property, oversaw the construction of the cabin, which would function as a way station and a rest area, would maintain the book that Mr. Jefferson would set out for people to write into their feelings of what they experienced at the Natural Bridge. There's a whole backstory to Patrick Henry's occupation of the Natural Bridge. One that is a very American, very unique story of slavery, of manumission, and the hope of freedom for people. And it's also, as I get into this, the thing it becomes so obvious about the Natural Bridge, once again, that historical and cultural thing was this Natural Bridge is about American Indian people. Mm-hmm. It's about African-American people. Mm-hmm. And it's about us Euro-Americans. It's all blended in together to tell a very unique story. We know also over the years the ability to tell of all the other people who were associated with the property until ultimately the 1900s coming, the establishment of hotels, houses, and then the end of World War II to where Natural Bridge really took in and began to establish itself as a very important place.
And I'd love to pause on that note about the many histories that the Natural Bridge holds for many different people. who have occupied and worked at the site for a long time. So with that idea in mind, I think we can invite Johanna, Dr. Minich in, who I know has thought also about some ideas and questions related to the different histories of the bridge, how they are represented or perhaps not very often represented in some of the works of the exhibition.
It's good to see you guys all here together again. And I had a lot of thoughts leading up to this exhibition. I knew it was happening, and I had never once been to the Natural Bridge. So I went about 6 months before the exhibition and was just blown away by the site. And then, of course, I've seen the exhibition and loved it so much that I took my daughter during spring break. We decided to take a little road trip around Virginia, and I took her to the Natural Bridge. I said, you have to see this place. And she was also blown away. She said, I had no idea it would make me feel, you know, she's a teenager, but for her to stand there and feel the presence of that place, I think said a lot. And I think that the attendance numbers of this exhibition too have been evidence that people are very interested in these histories, this notion of shared histories and sometimes buried histories, both, you know, literal buried histories and also metaphorically. You think, like Dean was talking about the archaeology, we also know that archaeological reports are often subjective too, because the people that wrote those reports were also writing from a perspective of, you know, 18th, 19th, 20th century, usually European American perspective. So a lot of times we don't know the whole story. And I think particularly in Virginia, there is this real groundswell of interest in our history, the history of our state. And we've seen it with all of the discussion about, you know, why the monuments were erected for the first time on Monument Avenue and what's the history behind those, and what stories are we not telling. And so I think that this exhibition has been a great opportunity for us to start these conversations and to fill in a lot of these gaps. So Chris and I were talking about initially, you know, is there any historic Monacan Indian art that relates? And I, you know, my first thought was something like rock art or any images, you know, going back in time of native people who lived there. And I think you guys kind of touched on that already, but can we talk a little bit about how that site has been represented by native people who lived there and who continue to live there? And it sounds like it's mostly oral history, and perhaps there are some images maybe that have yet to be discovered that are etched in rock or something, but if you guys have any additional comments about that.
Well, okay, first off, let me say this. To my knowledge, the only archaeology, genuine archaeology ever conducted at Natural Bridge was done by my staff archaeologist, Chelsea Dudley Smith. And that was about 5 years ago, 6 years ago. And due to one thing or another, which is not the place to get into, we really didn't have an opportunity to fulfill the charge of doing enough archaeology to, number one, establish where Mr. Jefferson's cabin actually existed. We believe we know pretty good. Empirical evidence is kind of but accordingly, we think we know where that was at. The question about the grave robbing that took place around 1950-51, that was something that was really obscured and buried because at that time, people just, you know, they don't care. I mean, I don't know if that's correct to say they didn't care, but the awareness level was simply not there, okay? To know that you're digging up human remains, oh, it's just a bunch of Indians, you know. Oh, we got some arrowheads, oh boy, you know. The respect that was necessary to give a very concise reading of the archaeology from the perspective of Native American people and the African American as well as the Euro-American perspective had never taken place. So much has changed around the property when you start to look at just, you go back to the construction of the original gatehouse. All of that turned into a big attempt to market Natural Bridge, turned it into a major attraction. And with doing that, the bulldozers pretty much destroyed whatever archaeological record on the top side existed. And all my years on the Natural Bridge property, and I've walked every inch of that property in one way or another, I never found the first projectile point. However, I talked to other folks that lived in the area, go, yeah, let me show you what I found up on Golf Course Road one day, you know, and they would find it. So the archaeological record, I think if there was a very focused attempt to do some recovery there and learn something, I think that should be done and implemented as soon as possible before everything else is completely destroyed and lost, you know.
And well, let me say too that the one thing that I've noticed while doing the interpretations that we do is today we have the opportunity for art. You know, back then it was survival. And so the only thing that I could hope for us to find that would give us any information would maybe be a piece of pottery, maybe with some etchings, you know, specific to that. And we just simply haven't found any of that yet. The only other thing that we have is, as we mentioned before, the Monacan legend of Natural Bridge, which my understanding was not kept by us as Monacans, but was kept by the Algonquin speakers. And so it makes it difficult, you know, to try to tie in what type of art or things may have been left behind from past generations that we would still have available for us today. And it is a sacred place to us. And sometimes that makes a difference. You may go there to pray. You may go there to have your solitude. You know, years ago, go to do a ceremony for the people who've been buried there, but not necessarily do the things that we would think of doing to it or with it today.
Well, that kind of ties into my next question, actually, and Chris can pull up some images. When I was moving through the exhibition, of course, there's a lot of really gorgeous landscape paintings that you think of in the traditional terms, but one of those really stuck with me, and I wanted to talk about this one a little bit. It's a French wallpaper design that includes these representations, obviously of the Natural Bridge, but also of Native people sort of quote unquote performing for Euro-American tourists. And that image in particular stuck with me because it is obviously it borders on the clearly the fanciful artistic representation or understanding of this place. And so I wondered if you guys and Chris would like to weigh in on this image and how it came to be in the exhibition and anything you want to add to that.
A lot of these images, like you say, this is the idyllic image that white America portrays. That's pretty obvious in the artwork. The Native people, this very, very, you know, everybody getting along and all of that is very fanciful, because when this was printed, painted, the Indian people of Virginia were in bad shape. But many of this art and everything, it reflects back upon a nation trying to figure, a very young nation trying to figure out who in the world we are.
Right.
You have a young nation that is competing with Europe. You have a young nation that just really hasn't quite figured it out yet. And you see a lot of these paintings which depict this idyllic little Native American thing, you know, sitting around smoking a pipe, eating deer meat and this sort of thing. This, once again, is a version, and I don't know of any way to say it, but this is white America's version of these events, which the Native American version, or even for that fact, the African American version, is avoided. And this is, once again, we're faced with the things that we hear today, and the ideas of what is systemic racism and things such as that. All one needs to do is go back and look at the paintings, as beautiful as they are. they depict a time that never actually happened. And with that, it sort of gives a false narrative,
yes,
to these events. And I'm certainly not trying to anger anyone or anything such as that. This is our history. And it's through these conversations that we're able to say these things, and hopefully we can open a door of understanding and say, well, what were the Black folks thinking about this? Or what were the Indian people thinking about this? You know, because all we're really getting is the perspective of my white ancestors. So there again, when it comes to this, there is this narrative, there is an irrational idea of an America that simply never existed. And the perpetuation of this America that never existed, and in my opinion, is pretty much why we're experiencing much of the problems that we experience today. And as I say, you go back to the time and the medium of what it is, it's the art. And you go back and you read the readings of this, that, and whatnot in regard to the local area, to the local people, and their sentiments, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The narrative that we have, once again, I always say this, my opinion is not an accurate one, because the depictions, for example, that you see there is this idyllic world which didn't exist. But
and it also says we like to go around and perform for people a lot.
Yeah, I think those are both great points. I mean, Dean, the idyllic world that doesn't exist is what we put in the title of the show, Virginia, Arcadia. And the idea of performance here is so important, because while the viewers are racially integrated, there's a stratification between the performers and who gets to inspect. And while, of course, again, the integration of the different races as the viewers is, of course, as much of fantasy as it is the wardrobe that the performing Native figures are wearing, which, you know, to me, don't look like anything derived from North American regalia, but more, you know, Asian or elsewhere. And I think really speaks to it being a French production for white audiences, you know, American and French. Exactly. And that the clothes they're wearing signify that they're just not white. And it's almost a colonial French desire too, because it's not that specific. It need not be, at least.
It's a true marketing piece, if you think about it, because years ago they were trying to get people to come here and settle the land and do all of these things. And if you come here, look what paradise looks for you. Don't you want to move here and be a part of this? So it's an excellent marketing piece, which Virginia was marketed from the early days.
And remember, this is, as it sounds so ugly when I speak it, but this was not about anybody but white folks. This wasn't for Black folks. This wasn't for Native people. This was for white folks. You know, when I was at Natural Bridge in the years, when I was rummaging around one afternoon, as I was always pilfering around to see what I could find, I found in the basement the signage which said colored only. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was for the one restroom down, colored only, you know. And I brought it up because I wanted to keep it. I want these items to be archived, and I found that it disappeared shortly after I found it. And it was because nobody wanted to hear that, you know. It's the same thing that I dealt with in once again in the narrative, in the false narratives, and one particular with George Washington. They will go unnamed, but I was accosted one afternoon and wanted to know why I was running around telling everybody that George Washington didn't put his initials on the wall. And I simply said, prove to me that he did, and I'll quit telling folks that he put his initials on the wall. Says, well, it's common knowledge. I said, no, it's not. It's written down, but that doesn't mean it's right. So once again, the narrative that was constructed was one that if we really dissect it and look at it today, you're going to stand back from it if you're a thinking individual and you go, wow, that wasn't about her. And it wasn't about people that looked like her.
Right.
It was about people that looked like me.
And that's why it was so important to have the to have the tribe itself, or to have Native people involved with the telling of their own story, because sometimes we have to go back in and re-correct this and say, well, it wasn't exactly like that, and tell the truth. And you know, we talked about this before, the wallpaper, they produced it and it shows up in other places. And it's really kind of neat when you see it, like at the bank here in Roanoke. It's on one of the walls of the old bank there. But it's really neat when you see it. But I like Dean's word, it's kind of fantasy, which that's okay. Mm-hmm. You know, but well, we get to correct it. We get to tell the story our way, which is important today, that people have control of the narrative and the story they're trying to tell about their own history.
Yeah, I totally agree. You guys are giving me the perfect segues for my next questions, because we talk about this idea of who's looking at these images, who are these images created for. And so we have I think the next image that Chris has, there's a lot of these landscapes that you'll see in the exhibition, and they're a little bit atypical of the other landscapes you think about. For example, the perfect example that comes to mind is our famous Asher B. Duran progress painting, where these practices of landscape artists would use the plein air technique to make sketches and then come back to their studio and create an idyllic or ideal landscape by combining different elements, different parts to make the perfect sky, the perfect tree line. And they do that to some extent here, but artists like Duran like to put in Native American sort of characters, almost like a prop to continue this myth of the vanishing race of Native people. And they tend to be largely absent in these landscapes of the Natural Bridge. And I'm wondering if that's because this is such a very specific location. They were already touting America, and specifically like Virginia, as this land of unspoiled wonders and beautiful places that would appeal to tourists and people that were adventurous. So I think that, you know, in my mind, some of these American painters were promoting this idea of new discovery, and putting Native people in these landscapes would spoil the idea that you can come out here to these undiscovered places. And so I'm just wondering if you guys have any perspective on that, why we tend to have an absence of Native figures in images of the Natural Bridge.
When you look at the time that the paintings were being done, Virginia Indians by and large have been assimilated.
They were already marginalized to the point almost not even out of existence.
Yeah, and so we did not exist in the way that we did exist when the Europeans first came here. So we're not, and then our numbers are low. I mean, like our numbers get down. I think Eastern Siouan people go from maybe, they guess 10 to 15,000 in 1607 down to, you know, less than 1,000 by 1714. So there are not many of us, Eastern Siouan, part of the Monacan group, still around. And those of us who are around have been forced into assimilation, European clothing. We speak English. We've been told we can't speak our language. We've been forced into Christianity and things like that. So we're simply, by 1835 here in Virginia, you're going to have to go across the New River and get into the territory that was once controlled by the Cherokee to actually start to find people who are going to depict.
Who were still collectively and traditionally living as Indian people.
And they're not long, because by 1838, they're being, they're removed.
Right.
And so you could see these paintings here in Virginia, we're not there because we're not there.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think that it's one of these things. It's painful.
Yeah.
It's very painful. It's painful to me to talk about it in many ways, and because I've never shied away from it. But it's painful because you oftentimes have to confront a situation, and people say, well, I don't know where you get your information from. You talk like blah blah blah. But if you are woke, which incidentally I hate that term, but if you are woke, you're turned on to this narrative, and you see that the narrative that was established is a false narrative.
Right.
This false narrative has been perpetuated by the ongoing racism that when you deny it, when it's right in front of you and you still can't accept what it is, it gets that much harder, because folks call that revisionist history. It's not revisionist. You're just trying to get it right. You've told one side of the story and you've left out the entire experience by marginalizing two significant races of people.
Right. And let me say, when I said we're not there, it means, no, we're not there in the pictures or there at Natural Bridge at the time. We're still here because we're here today.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want somebody to think that I was saying, hey, she said they were going. No. We were still here. I mean, if I go back in 1835 and look at the amount of land that our ancestors were sitting on in Amherst County, it was quite a bit. So we're still here. But we are not part of the European thought processes. Our people are just seen as free people of color, and we're treated differently. Even though we're landowners and we've got all these things going on, we're still not treated like the people you see them drawing in that picture right there. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're treated differently.
And I think that's a very important point to make is that even if absent from these images, there is an ongoing and persistent presence of the people themselves.
Right.
But we do only have a few minutes left. So I want to ask Izzy, because I think we were getting questions from some of the attendees, whether there's some audience questions.
Yes, absolutely. Maybe some just basic questions first, Victoria and Dean. Have you been recording the oral history and traditions to use in exhibits? And
I actually have a huge bunch of research that I've compiled, and it's extensive. And I've done programs or presentations on that, but I actually have gone back and worked pretty hard in trying to document and bringing in the primary source documents, writing down oral traditions that were in my family or that we have gathered, like Miss Birdie and I would sit there and talk about different things. And so I realized the importance of me writing those things down. So I have a nice book of information that I've been able to document. And I would really like to one day be able to sit down and get it edited, mm-hmm. and have that body of work available if for nobody else but those of us in the tribe. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. So we have that foundation laying there for us. But yes, I have worked really hard. I'm not saying I have it all, because there's always something out there. There's always something that you missed or question you didn't ask. So there's always the possibility for there to be more, but I have worked on that.
About 6 years ago, I guess now, when the park, the Natural Bridge, moved from the Puglisi family to VCLF, there was a major effort made on recording local oral traditions in regard to the Natural Bridge. I was personally involved in quite a number of them, but it's unfortunate because due to one thing or another, they are no longer accessible.
Right.
I don't even know if they even exist anymore. But there was just a wealth of oral tradition there. This was from both local Monacan people and also as well as just your local descendants of the original settlers in the region. Their story, the whole, you know, if you're from Rockbridge County, either you or somebody you know at one time in your life worked at Natural Bridge. That's just how it is. And so many people have so many stories that they tell, and some of them come back to their grandfathers or their great grandmothers that was passed down. And of course, we know how oral tradition is, but there's a lot of truth as well. And it breaks my heart that we cannot access this. It's so sad because there is a wealth of information.
And the one thing we did try to do is we went out into the African American community. We had somebody who worked there, and we said to them, what tradition remains in your community about Patrick Henry? Because we thought it was important doing what we do, that if there was anything out there, things that people were saying, oral traditions that were being kept, that we asked somebody. And so the person who worked in that position did do that and had an excellent program that added some of that information to it. So we try. I guess that's the bottom line.
We tried.
And it sounds like an ongoing work for both of you to make sure that that's recorded and preserved.
Yes.
Another question, could you provide the current status of the Monacan exhibit at the Natural Bridge?
Yeah, we're on a hiatus right now.
Words carefully.
Yes, I am. When COVID came in and we had the indoor exhibit open, and I had just finished like 2 weeks before every elementary, second grade school in Roanoke City doing outreach programs for them, because there again, we think that's important, especially in inner city schools where kids don't have cars. Yeah. And so I just finished that, and we had the indoor exhibit open, and we closed it when the governor closed the schools, because we realized being in an indoor environment was not going to be good for us. And so we thought we were going to open back up maybe in June, maybe in July. Jamestown opened, Frontier Culture Museum opened, and they never called us back. So they decided to close it and kind of wanted to, I guess, work it from their own perspective, which the tribe has decided that we should have a say in our history. And so we will set up a meeting with the state on an upper level so that we can discuss just that, the program and what should happen to it, and talk about the involvement that we would expect to have as a federally recognized tribe as a government to government conversation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And hope to hear more about that very soon. There were numerous questions on that front, because obviously
I think people miss us.
So knowledgeable.
Yeah, it's from my perspective, I don't have an axe to grind with anybody, because quite frankly, at this point in my life, I'm really glad I'm not there now.
He's retired.
I gave Natural Bridge 20 good years. Ticks, hot, cold, days where we literally talked to 12, 13, 1,400 visitors. That's just one day.
Yeah. More.
The overwhelming number of visitors to the Natural Bridge Park, it was very, very difficult. Or as I say now, it's not a job for an old man, okay? 20 years ago, I was up to it. Now I'm not. I don't know what she says she is, but I don't know. The thing is that times have changed.
Yeah, but we'll see. I mean, I guess we should say more to come.
Yes.
We would hope. We would hope. The thing is that there is a big gap now in the telling of the native people in the Piedmont, Blue Ridge, and on Ridge and Valley portion of the Commonwealth. This story we were able to tell, and we told on a daily basis, and we introduced so many people to, well, I never heard of Monacan Indians before. My great-grandmother's Cherokee, but we never heard of Monacans. Right. Of course you didn't, because they were written out of history. So the ability to come back and reestablish the Monacan presence through just the exhibit, and that people know that these native people are still here. And no, they don't live like this today, but they're still here. And this is, once again, this is part of the story. And I think that the Commonwealth is remiss if they don't continue to pick this story up and tell. We can talk about the biodiversity, and we can talk about all the things that are not controversial, and we can step away from this. And when we do that, then we're guilty again of not being forthright. We're guilty of not telling the story. And then you come back down the road 20 years from now, and somebody really gets upset. Well, how come we weren't taught this? How come now we have to hear this? We didn't hear it then. And that was the thing that was always important to me about the Natural Bridge and the Monacan project, was that we were openly able to discuss discrimination, racism, the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. We were able to discuss the destruction of a culture, the rebirth of a culture, without, anyone really restricting this. It was at one point, sometimes maybe I think that we found we had to reel ourselves in, because it's very emotional. And unfortunately, it gets political. And when you're dealing with these situations, when you choose to ignore it, and you say, well, we don't want to talk about that, then you've just basically slammed the door of knowledge that could very well have opened a mind somewhere that horrific events will not take place because somebody was turned on earlier to events that happened here when this was a colony, when this was our horrific racial strife in this state. All of these things really kind of summed it up with the Native American experience, because so many times when we would tell folks that in 1924, the state of Virginia simply declared that if you have one drop of African blood, you're Black, period. There is no discussion. And then we talk about, we're able to, and when she has the personal experience of speaking of how Native people and people of color and poor people were treated by simply being lobotomized or sterilized. This is our history. Nobody wants to hear it. But without doing this, we are losing a very important part of the story and an attempt to heal. We can't heal until we bring it all out and lay it out there to see, and then say, this can never happen again.
Right, absolutely. Well, those were our questions, and we can't get to everything, but maybe I could connect with Vicki and Dean offline to answer just a few more, and we can send a follow-up email to everybody, especially when this recording is available. So thank you all so much, Chris, Joanna, Vicki, and Dean, for bringing this conversation to us today, and hopefully this inspires some of our viewers today to come back to Virginia Arcadia and take another look to think about that story that we've been trying to share today. Chris, Joanna, would you like to say anything else?
Thank you to Dean and Vicki.
Yeah, you have a couple of weeks left, so do it soon.
Yes, August 1st. Again, everybody, the exhibition is free. So August 1st is the day that it will close. Thank you, everyone. And again, thank you to our speakers today. I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.